Hey everyone, so in this slideshow we are going to talk about informational graphics, also known as data visualizations. We live in an era of information overload. We have for quite a long time, most of your lifetimes as a matter of fact. So it is estimated that a week's worth of the New York Times contains more information, today's New York Times, than a person was likely to come across in a lifetime back in the 18th century. So it's incredible. We have so much access to data and information. So we don't need more of the data. We don't need any more of the information, but we need ways to communicate that information in an effective, efficient, digestible form. And presenting that visually is probably the most effective way to communicate it. Even the most simple visualizations can really help a person digest data. The human brain is really not meant to look at data sets, especially really large data sets, but even small ones like this, and be able to make calculations and comparisons. We are more visually oriented. So for example, in this very small data set that you're seeing, or I guess more like a series of numbers, how many sevens do you see? That's taking a fair amount of counting and processing. Now how many sevens do you see? So do you see how just the teeniest, tiniest visualization, in this case just color, made it so much easier for you to digest the numbers here? And of course they get infinitely more complicated and ornate than this, but this is a really rudimentary example. For a little bit more advanced example, let's take a look at this, which is just a simple data set that talks about the correlation between the education that a person attains and their income, their salary. So look at this and see if you can figure out who makes the most, who makes the least, and maybe even by how much. In this case, you can probably make some guesses, but you might be surprised in some ways to find out the answer. So if we look at the visualization, you probably weren't too far off, but you can see that professional degrees do indeed make more than doctoral degrees, and you can make more rigid comparisons in terms of high school to college to bachelor's and so on. And you can see the mean, and you can see unemployment rates and make those comparisons with earnings. So much easier to digest when it's visualized. Infographics function to do a number of things. There can be a point of entry into a subject or a story in a newspaper. They can be sidebars to stories. They can also stand alone. More and more we're seeing infographics be their own news piece or advertising piece or any mass communication piece. They can be something like a recap of main points. They can clarify facts or just give more details about a certain aspect of a subject or a subject. All right, so let's get to back to where I should have started. What is an infographic? And I've kind of come up with this definition based on a number of definitions I've read, because you will find a million out there if you look for them. But ultimately, it's a simple illustrated composition that lays out a set of information or data about a subject. And information or data is basically the same thing. Some people think of data as only being quantitative in nature, so numbers, but it can certainly be qualitative as well, which is, well, we'll get to that in a moment, but that's information that is not number-based. Why do we use infographics? Well, we can use them for many different reasons. For those of us in the journalism school, we do a number of things in terms of communicating to the mass. So we inform, we persuade, we explain and entertain. All of these things can be better done through an informational graphic. We can use an infographic to inform people about a certain topic. We can use this in an advertisement or a public relations campaign to persuade people in a certain way. Also, it's becoming more popular to use infographics for entertainment. I know in my house I have a poster it's all of the different kinds of birds in North America. My husband has one that's sort of a weird typology of different kinds of beer because he's a home brewer. So these things are now something that we'll actually hang on a wall. And the ultimate goal of an infographic is to make less digestible information more clear, more easily digestible. Again, as I said, the human brain is not good with numbers, but they are good at visuals. So the job of an infographic designer is to take those numbers and digest them for people, not to dumb them down, but to make them more digestible in a visual form. Great infographics do a number of things. So they will communicate complex ideas with clarity and also precision and simplicity. They're designs that give the viewer, and this is an Edward Tufty quote, we'll get to him in a moment, but we want to give the viewer the greatest number of ideas in the shortest amount of time with the least ink in the smallest space. And when I say least ink, that includes pixels. Basically, we're saying we don't want a bunch of fluff or filler. And not all infographic designers think that way. We'll talk about those philosophies in a few slides down. You don't want to dumb things down, as I said. You want to leave some room for people to explore on their own. So to make their own comparisons and to make their own conclusions about things. There are tons of different kinds of data visualizations or informational graphics. This is not an exhaustive list at all, but there are things like how-tos, how to tie a scarf, for example, diagrams, what something looks like, breaking it down. In news sites, you might see things like fast facts or bio boxes, quick snapshots about people. You'll also see lists and checklists. Those are more interactive. You're inviting the viewer to join you in figuring something out about themselves. Question and answers, tables, timelines, maps, and then charts and graphs. I don't want to go through every single one of these because if I did, it would be a very, very long slideshow. But I wanted to point out a few that I thought I had good examples for, and then we will go through a few of the main kinds of charts and graphs. Diagrams are very often showing different kinds of structures or buildings and things that we normally can't have access to in an easy to digest way. I liked this one. It was from Fast Company, and it was in an article titled What the Statue of Liberty Would Look Like If It Was Broken Down into Apartments. And I just thought this one was really interesting. And given that New York City is really, really short on space and things are incredibly expensive, it was just kind of an interesting exploration of something that theoretically could happen, probably won't, but really fun to visualize and think about. This is one example of a timeline, and I apologize, I tried very hard to get a nice big version of this up for you all, but even when I went to the original source, for some reason it was very hard to see. But you can get the general point of this, which is great thinkers throughout history and how they kind of increase in time, which may or may not be true. It might just be that we have more data as we move forward in time about these people, so we have bigger lists, but kind of an interesting way to visualize qualitative data, which information about people would be that, but also some quantitative data, in this case being years, the time. Oh, I'm so sorry. please ignore this title that says timeline. This is obviously a map, and there are millions of maps out there about all kinds of things, but I kind of like this one that was the most popular brand in each state. So in our state, it looks like Denny's is the most popular brand, apparently. And in my home state, Super 8, which is bizarre. Not what I would expect. And my husband here, it's Apple in California. So interesting. See what your state's most popular brand is. I actually did live in Oklahoma for a while, and there was a Sonic like on every block. So that one doesn't surprise me. So when to use these different kinds of charts and graphs. There are more than these three different kinds: bar charts, line graphs, and pie charts. These are kind of the big three, but there are combinations of these, there are advanced versions of these, and there are other things like bubble charts and more advanced visualizations that we just won't get into in this presentation. If you are a VisCom major or would like to become a VisCom major, you will take an informational graphics class where you will learn more types and in greater depth. But when there's a lot of math, a lot of numbers, charts and graphs really come in handy. They present numerical data in a more simple, more visual way. And usually the more simple, or the simpler, the better. So let's talk about bar charts. Really simple form of data visualization. And we are comparing values between groups or periods of time, typically. And we're comparing two or more items by sizing them as columns, or bars, that are parked side by side, or can be, of course, many, many, many columns. There are two main components to bar charts. There's a scale running either horizontally or vertically that shows totals or an amount of something. And then there's bars. There are bars that extend in the same direction, representing the items being measured. So it's much easier to show than to tell. That's kind of confusing. And this is a really familiar form of data visualization. So I have a feeling it's not something that you need a ton of explaining about. I love this bar chart because it's just really fascinating, and I wish I could find a more updated version of it. I looked and looked and I can't, but it's all about alcohol consumption in the United States. And I think it goes only up to about 2010, but I certainly would like to see an updated version of that, because in the last 5 years or so, there's been a huge up and a huge down. During the pandemic, I think that alcohol consumption really increased. And right now, we're in a period where non-alcoholic beverages are really popular, and people are consuming less, from what I've heard on a number of news sites and so on. So I tried to look for those stats and for a better visualization, but could not find one. But anyway, if you go back way to the 1770s here, when the Republic began, there was a lot of alcohol consumption here. This is a Declaration of Independence being signed, and people are consuming a lot of alcohol. In some ways, it's because the water was not great, right? There was a lot of sanitation. There were sanitation issues. It was actually bad for your health in some ways to drink water that wasn't fermented in many places in many cases. So alcohol was one way to get some fluids without the negative bacterias. So there was a ton of alcohol consumption early on in the history of the United States. Here we see the temperance movement and a sharp decrease in consumption. And of course, here we see prohibition. Alcohol was outlawed. You couldn't drink alcohol. Of course, people still did. They found ways to do that, but the numbers are way down. And then I think this is kind of where the craft brewing boom started here. And again, as I said, I'd love to see what came next. I imagine it as being something like a flat line for a while, a spike, and a sharp decrease. I don't know. If you find it, let me know. I'll give you extra credit. This is a stacked bar chart. Don't ask. I think that I was just on a kick of looking at alcohol consumption, but I thought this one was a good example as well. So alcohol consumption by country, and broken down in terms of beer, wine, spirits, or other. So it looks like Belarus has the highest alcohol consumption rate by quite a bit, and they are really into their spirits, not wine much at all, a little bit of beer, but lots of spirits and other. Then we're on to Russia. Again, very little wine and tons of spirits and no other. I'm not sure what that other category is. And then we're just moving down the line. So we are here. We are heavy beer drinkers and kind of heavy wine drinkers. France drinks tons of wine. Anyway, really interesting, rich data that you can get from a stacked bar chart, because you're not only looking at amounts, but you're looking at breakdowns of amounts and comparing those pretty easily. So you could spend some time with this if it was a topic you were interested in. This was another one that I found that I just thought was kind of interesting. It's pretty small here. It's kind of hard to see. It's one of the downsides of Keynote and PowerPoint, but this is kind of how people spent their time during the pandemic in 2019 and 2020. One thing I don't like about this bar chart, by the way, I keep doing that, I'm so sorry, is that you have to use this little legend and you have to kind of match things up. And that's annoying to me, but we'll get to that soon. But people spent most of their time socializing, relaxing, and leisure, quite a bit of time on household activities, eating and drinking, work, and then way up at the top, things like professional care services, purchases, traveling, not much traveling at all. So another really interesting one, and it's pretty even across the 2 years. Those activities don't look to have changed very much. Let's talk about fever graphs, also called line graphs, or sometimes trend charts. Most commonly, I think, known as line graphs. They measure changing quantities over time. Time is kind of the big component here that you want to remember about line graphs. That's why they're also called trend charts sometimes. And there are 3 components to this as opposed to the 2 components of the bar chart. So we're going to have a scale that runs vertically along one edge, measuring amounts, and then a scale that goes horizontally along the bottom, and that measures time. And then there's the line, of course, the jagged line that connects these points, the time and the measurements, to show rising or falling trends. And again, I think you all are probably pretty familiar with this, but here's one that I thought was kind of cool about music revenues according to different forms of music distribution. So we have vinyl, cassette, 8-track is way down there, I guess, CDs, MP3s, ringtones, and then, let's see, what's that tiny one? Oh, ad-supported and streaming. So you can see cassettes really made tons of money, way more money than MP3s are making or than streaming services are making, way more than vinyls or 8-tracks for sure ever made. CDs and cassettes both made tons of money. The bottom line about this graph to me is that it's becoming much more difficult to make money in the music industry, of course. And then we have pie charts, another familiar one of the big 3. And in this case, we're comparing parts that make up a whole. And this is kind of a circle that represents 100% of something, and then slices of that circle, or slices of the pie, that divide it into smaller percentages. And each piece of the pie is an accurate proportion of that 100%. This is a really detailed one. Of course, it can be extremely simple, but this one is more relevant, and I thought I'd use it as an example, all about Ukraine's trade. So trades with China being very, very high, both imports and exports. The yellow being imports and the blue being exports, followed by Germany, Poland, Russia, and the United States is way, way down there, which I think is a good thing at this point. And it breaks down data into more than just amounts, but that's what I can see at this scale, actually. So many infographics are organized in this way. There's going to be a key message, usually the headline, what are we talking about? And then what's the problem? So explain what's going on here. What are we looking at and why? And then there's the solution. That's the information. That's the visual, the visualization. And in many cases, if it is a persuasive infographic, so you're trying to get the viewers to do something, there's going to be a call to action. So what can I do about this problem that was just presented? If it's informational, it also might have some kind of a call to action or a way to get some more information about the topic. For example, you might see an infographic that's about pet adoption, and you might find adoptions are down, but people taking their animals in to be adopted are going up. So there's an imbalance there. And so the what can I do, the call to action would be, go adopt a pet, or maybe spay and neuter or something like that. Here is an example of a student piece where we have, again, the headline, there's an explanation, data. This one was about Hurricane Katrina and aid being offered by other countries. And then there is a call to action down here that's a little bit hard to see. You also typically have sources. Where did this information come from? And who created this overall graphic? If you were using graphics or photos, you would also want to cite those. There are two main philosophies about infographics, and this is really narrowing it down and probably oversimplifying a little bit. But if I had to break it down into two, it would be the philosophy popularized by Edward Tufty and that popularized by Nigel Holmes. Tufty was really into just the data and the accuracy and no embellishment. He wrote a famous book. He's written many, many books, but the one that sort of brought him to the attention of many was the visual display of quantitative information. And so some of his key points were that infographics should not use more ink than data. As I said, in today's language, we might more often think about pixels than ink. But when he began, it was really ink. And what he means by that is, again, no fluff, just show the data. And we shouldn't be having any kind of illustrations or anything. He said that infographics should be brilliantly crafted as to display multiple meanings without confusion. Shouldn't have any chart junk, and by that he did mean illustrations and fluff. And he really thought that visuals muddy comprehension of the data. In many ways, Nigel Holmes was the exact opposite. He was all about including visuals in his infographics and trying to entertain audiences as well as attracting people to the infographic. So getting their attention, entertaining them while they're being informed about something. So Tufty, again, well-designed presentation of interesting data. It's going to be a matter of substance, statistics, and design, but not illustration. He wanted to communicate complex ideas with this clarity and precision, and always keeping things as simple as possible. And as I said, the least ink, the least space, the greatest number of ideas. So his charts and graphs look like this. I mean, there's really not much to show you in terms of visual well, I shouldn't say that. It's just not very illustrated is what I mean. It's not embellished in any way, but they're very smart. They're really rich. There are lots of data points going on here, many comparisons being made, and lots of room for the viewer to explore and to ask their own questions and to come into their own conclusions. These screenshots are from his newest book, and I couldn't find one that was really big enough to explore with you, and all the ones that I could find were pretty dry, but I just want you to kind of understand his philosophy, which is sort of just the facts and nothing else. Now this is an example of what you might see from Nigel Holmes, which is the exact opposite. He has a fine arts degree. He is a graphic designer by trade, more than a statistician, but he does both really well. And his are, of course, much more visually attracting, much more compelling. There are illustrations as well as data. He's really great at incorporating the principles of graphic design, and works for a number of clients, including, well, any of the big companies that you can possibly name, and I believe started out in Time magazine. Really popular in the 70s up until today. Let's talk about a few other key players. There are so many more than this. I'm just going to name 3 in this lecture because it's not an informational graphics class, it's intro, and I could go into a great amount of detail, but I'm going to try not to. Other people, all the way back from Da Vinci up into, a number of people, Florence Nightingale, into like the USA Today, contemporarily. These are key players in the history of informational graphics. But again, I just want to touch on a few of the ones that stand out to me the most. If you take the infographics class at some point, we'll go into more depth. Definitely want to talk about William Playfair. He's a Renaissance man, so he's right at that period of time where people are exploring and doing a lot with their brains. They're not relying on the church for explanations, and he does so many different things. He's a millwright, an engineer, a draftsman, a statistician, an economist, a journalist. You name it, he did it, because that's kind of what a Renaissance man means. Really an Enlightenment thinker. And in 1786, he basically created infographics, I would say, in many ways. Certainly there were others that were describing things and doing things like diagrams, but he's sort of considered the father or founder of infographics, and I would consider him to be the founder of infographics. And in this book, he created 43 line charts, bar charts, and pie charts. So he did all of the big 3 that we just talked about. And the book was really the first major work to contain these graphs at all. He coined the term infographics. They were kind of text heavy. They were not what Tufty would approve of, but they're really, really smart. We'll look at one in a second here. He was great in Europe, but Americans didn't really get infographics for a long, long time. Let's see. This is a Playfair. I apologize for being out of order here, but what we're looking at here, and again, this is like the late 1700s, so it's pretty impressive. Exports and imports to and from Denmark and Norway. And this is from 1700 to 1780. So you can imagine there was no Excel, there was no calculator, there were no data sets that were accessible, and you weren't able to just click some buttons and get these numbers. This really was a tremendous amount of work, so it's very impressive. And you can look at thousands and thousands of points of data very, very quickly and come up with a conclusion, which is that basically early on we see imports as greater, and then imports are much, much less. So the balance was in favor of England later in the 1700s. Let's get back here to Charles Minard, who's the next big figure that I want to talk about. He's French, and he sees the work of William Playfair and decides to take it a little further with not only the data, the bar charts, the line graphs, and the pie charts, but also look at maps and geography. This is his most famous informational graphic, and according to many, this is the best, or at least the most famous, infographic created of all time. It's a flow map of Napoleon's march to Moscow in 1812. You're probably at least a bit familiar with that. So let me kind of walk you through this the best that I can. Again, it's small on this keynote presentation, but because it's visualized pretty well, you can get the big points of it. Beginning on the left at the Polish-Russian border, so we are looking at geography as well as numbers. The width and the thick band, that shows the size of the Grand Army at each position. So they're starting out in a similar position there. The upper brown line shows the size of the army, which in this case was 422,000 men, as it progresses eastbound to Moscow. And then the army turns around to head home. That's a decreasingly wide, a nice thin line there, the black ribbon, and that shows the dwindling size of the army, which is cross-referenced to time as well as temperature scales. Only about 10,000 men returned from this journey, so from 422,000 to 10,000, and you can just see that visualized really, really well. And it's certainly a brutal chapter of history. At any time during the campaign, the chart conveys direction, it shows size, and it shows loss relative to the start. And then on the retreat, it also conveys time, position of the army, and temperature. So a really, really, really smart graph. Again, created in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s. So extremely impressive how this was created. It took a tremendous amount of thought. And this is Joseph Priestley, the next big figure that I want to talk about. I won't go into much depth with him, but he takes all of the ideas of previous thinkers and combines it into this super infographic where he's looking at time and progress and duration and so much. So this chart is basically a history of the world, more or less, a history of the empires and rises and falls of different people in the world. I don't have the exact years here, but it's incredible. Like, he's trying to visualize the history of the world here. Again, really text heavy, but there are things here like numbers. There are comparisons of amount by the font size, and then we have the time aspect here as well. So those are some of the greats, not all of the greats by any stretch of the imagination. But I next want to talk about the things you shouldn't do when creating an infographic and give you some things to think about when you are looking at these online. They run rampant on social media, and some of them are just not that well done. So let's look at some of the thou shalt nots of informational graphics. The first one that I want to talk about is the big number infographic, which is kind of like, hey, I have a big number here, and there you go. It's impressive, right? That's really not a data visualization of any kind, and there's no context whatsoever, which means you can't make sense of it. 88% compared to what? What does that mean? Big fonts and no context means that people can't glean any meaning from this at all. So, for example, if we say there are approximately 2.8 billion global internet users back in 2013, well, compared to how many people are there and why and those types of things. It's really tough to visualize a number by itself. Even if we try and put it in a bar chart, it means nothing. And we kind of know how many people live in the world. That's a number that people just know. But you can imagine how pointless this would be if it was a number people don't know. But even then, if we look at, well, this is ever so slightly outdated, but 7 or 8 billion people on Earth and 2.8 billion internet users, we can really see, wow, most of the world doesn't have the internet. So visualizing is the first important thing. I'm not just having that number, but also making comparisons. Those are really important aspects of visualizing data and a successful infographic. Data shown as text only really provides no context as well. So here we have a similar thing, social media active users in 2016, and it's just showing like, all right, here's Facebook, here's YouTube, and Google and Snapchat. And this was a little bit before TikTok actually, which, yeah, this graph would change quite a bit if I got a more updated one. But again, there's no context. We can't really make heads or tails of this. And if we do, we have to spend time with it. We have to maybe get out our calculator or maybe write these things down and sort them. The brain's not made to do that. So this is really not a very successful infographic. And another thing that's done poorly is using chart legends like these when they are not necessary. It would be just as easy in this particular graph to put Gen Z here, like right there in the bar, and Gen Y in the bar, Gen X, and you get the point. Otherwise, we have to go back and forth and say, okay, what's blue? Okay, that's Gen Z. What's this kind of blue? Okay, that's a silent generation. So when possible, don't use a chart legend. If they're not necessary, it is so much easier to interpret the data. See how much easier that is? You want to keep your graphs simple. This is another example of a legend unnecessarily being used, but also an example of just too much data and not being able to make any sense of it. Executions in 2014, a really poorly designed infographic altogether, but the big thing I want to point out here is why can't you just put the name right there in the pie chart? That way we're not looking at, green, lighter green. Really confusing, especially when the colors are so similar. Of course, accuracy is of utmost importance in terms of infographic design. In terms of, you can make it as pretty as you want. You can make it as intricate as you want. It could be as relevant or just topical as a person can design it. But if the numbers are not correct or not portrayed correctly, it's not only a bad infographic, it's a harmful infographic because it's going to be portraying information to people that think it's accurate and spreading false information. Numbers, people tend to think that numbers are the truth, I guess, more than they do with other forms of communication. So when a chart or a graph is presented, people usually think that it's true because it just looks true. It's statistics, right? But let's look at this one. Another old example, but it was such a bad one that I keep coming back to it. People, wow, this is really quite old now, but people who backed Sarah Palin, Mitt Romney, and Huckabee during the election of, 16 years ago on Fox News. And what's wrong with this graphic? Well, it's a pie chart, and it's supposed to add up to 100%. And it adds up to very clearly much more than 100%. So something's wrong here. Here we can see 80% of your profit is generated by 20% of your customers. Well, what's wrong with this graphic? It's pretty easy to see that these numbers, 80% and 20%, should add up to 100, but those pieces of the graph fit together wouldn't fit together, right? There'd still be a gap there. So you can't just eyeball it when creating infographics. You have to be precise. There's also a problem of portraying data in different visualizations and some being more effective than others. We didn't talk about these very much, but this is called a bubble graph, where you see the big circles representing any amount, in this case, income. So the question up here is, how much would you save if federal income taxes were reduced 20%? And you can see up here, we have one number given to us. It's 1,679. And without looking at the bottom, how much would you guess this is? I mean, honestly, to me, it looks like this circle on the far right is, I don't know, 2 or 3 times as large. So I'd be like, I don't know, 3,000, 4,000. But if you look, it's actually almost $8,000. Bubble charts can be really misleading when you're trying to make direct comparisons. They're great for showing general trends, placing these bubbles on a map so we can make some big sweeping conclusions about things. But in this case, bubble charts are confusing because those amounts fit in the bubble in totally different ways. So if you have 400 million in the big blue dot, and if the black bubble there is 100 million, it doesn't quite work out because you can fit way more than 4 of those black dots into the blue dot, right? And the problem here is that we're not comparing width or height or distance. We're looking at area, which is very hard to comprehend, basically. So a better solution to the question that we were just looking at, how much would you save if federal income taxes were reduced by 20%, would be a bar chart. So you can see a much, much, much more striking difference between data presented in the 4th and 5th quartiles here, and a much easier way to comprehend that information. Another downfall of infographics, and I see this a lot on social media, is just a big pile of data, presenting way, way too much and overwhelming the viewer and really just having a bunch of clutter. You remember from the graphic design basics presentation that if you try and emphasize everything, you end up emphasizing nothing, and that's definitely the case here. There is so much information that I'm overwhelmed and would probably not look at this at all. I want to be able to look at it and explore and get a little bit more information, but this is too much, and they're trying to answer too many questions. You want to focus really on one point with many data points. All right, and that's it. That was quite a long presentation on infographics and a little bit dense as well, but it's a big topic. So that was just the broadest overview that I could give you for this 203 version of the topic.